Hi there, I'm Judy Holland, and welcome to HappiNest, the podcast where you can hear the latest research and best advice for living well when your kids leave home. Join me as I interview experts and explore how to reinvent yourself during this critical passage. I hope you'll head over to judyhollandauthor.com and check out my new book, HappiNest, Finding Fulfillment When Your Kids Leave Home. Welcome to another episode of HappiNest. I'm here today with Dr. Michael D. Kaplan, an assistant clinical professor at the Yale School of Medicine. Michael sees children, young adults, and families in his practice in New Haven. He also advises professionals, parent groups, and public schools about issues affecting children and families. Our subject today for parents of young adults is letting go. In this podcast, Michael shares insights about our relationships with young adults. I was surprised to learn that adolescents and young adults feel social rejection like it's a death. If they get rejected by a friend, romantic partner, fraternity, their emotion just about goes off the Richter scale. As seasoned adults, we take social rejection more lightly. We've had many relationships throughout our lives and are far less hurt by social rejection. If we understand these types of differences, it can really improve our relationships with our young adults. Welcome, Michael. Can you define for us, just starting out, what is the goal of parenthood when it comes to kids, but then to young adults? What's the goal?
Well, if we had to summarize one goal, that would be launching them into independent lives where they function on their own, they adapt to new situations, they're resilient, and they can rely upon their own resources to make their way in the world.
That's a big list.
Yes.
But yeah, no, that's the big picture. Now, when I'm in a relationship with my husband, the idea is not that we're going to separate, right? That we're going to keep working on this, but this is really a very jarring thing that you love somebody and you put all your energy and your resources into them, knowing that the outcome is a successful separation. That is probably the crux of this whole empty nest angst. Mm-hmm. It's a way different thing, isn't it?
Right. And what you're talking about, even in your question, is that it's from the parent perspective. Like the parent has to separate as much as the child has to separate. It's a two-way street. People think about separation as the kid separating away and becoming independent, but it's not done independently, even though they're becoming independent. The parent plays a big role in that as well. Right.
And one is affecting the other, right? Mm-hmm. So if the parent is not letting go, our subject for today, our parent is not letting go, perhaps, there's a boomerang or a bungee that's pulling the kid back and making things more difficult for the kid.
Exactly.
But just after raising kids for 18 years under your roof, why, Michael, is it so hard to let go? Is this wrapped up with I'm getting older? Did I lose a purpose? Did I lose my identity? I mean, what's in the big picture? Why is that such a rattling idea?
Well, I think it has to do with the changes in family structure, dynamics, and parenting over the last 20, 25 years. I doubt this podcast would be at all relevant to our own parents' generation. Say 25 years ago, they would probably think, what are you asking me about?
This is not your parents' empty nest.
Exactly. They may have actually enjoyed the empty nest and not, worried so much about what was happening. So I think what's happened in the last 20, 25 years is that parents have become more invested in their lives of their children, have contributed more, have gotten more out of those relationships. And once you invest in a relationship, it's an investment. And so you're not going to want to pull back from it or have some conflicts or be more ambivalent about it. So I think it's that investment, and not all investment is bad investment. I want to make that clear. So it's not as though every parent has become too invested in their children. It's a question of when it goes awry, or I think that's what we're going to get to, is what happens when that investment becomes too difficult to pull back from. I think children benefit from positive, proactive relationships with their parents. Mm-hmm. I think that's a benefit of the last 20, 25 years. People love to bemoan what parents are doing now to their children, but we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. And I think I know this from studying I think Jeffrey Jensen Arnett is one of I did a podcast with him recently, and he's talked about how kids who have parents who continue to be supportive and advise when the kids need advice and support when the kids need support, they actually go a lot farther. They've got a scaffolding, and they do a lot better, but it has to be done right.
Right. It's called involvement, not enmeshment. So when you're involved,
is that a thing? Are those terms of art?
They are. Well, enmeshment certainly and involvement. So that's how I like to think about it. If you're involved with your child's life, but not enmeshed, where the boundary between you and your child is clearly drawn, then I think that process of separation is easier on the parent. And if it's easier on the parent, it'll be easier on the child. Mm-hmm. A healthy separation from your child in terms of the empty nest doesn't mean that they get abandoned or they leave you permanently. You know the result has worked. It's a positive result when your child is still accessing you for help, sharing things that they're joyful for, sharing things that make them sad, asking for advice. Those are signs of a healthy empty nest.
So expand more on what constitutes a healthy separation. And I'm a reporter. I like examples. Like, can you give me an example of like how you might help your kid? I think you told me once something about helping your son mail a package or something.
Yeah.
Well,
right. And I think that's probably a good one. I think the idea of setting up a bank account, right? Like you go with them to the bank, but have them do the talking, right?
Yeah.
Or they
Because the bank is a big kind of intimidating place. If you haven't done that before in a bank, you might put that off.
Exactly. Or managing a bill, like when helping them see through what a credit card bill, even if they're on your credit card or on your phone, bill, sharing that with them and going over it with them. That sort of teaching them the skills that they need to move forward. When your child calls you because they're having trouble writing a paper, you don't instantly say, send it to me, I'm going to write it for you.
Right.
You ask, well, you ask questions. So examples would be not doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, like allowing them that you're watching them as they do the task. Mm-hmm. So I think that's sort of how it would work better. But again, the mailing the package, when the child says, I don't know, can you not mail the package? You can send them instructions or talk them through it, but have them engage in the activities. Kind of like the first time your child goes on an airplane by themselves. You work them through it. So when they're little, you may take them to the gate, but eventually you've worked it back, right? You drop them at the curb, you kiss them goodbye, and you let them go. Prior to that, you've gone through all the steps with them physically, and then, through talking about it, and then you actually let them go and you say, text me when you get to the gate. The kid gets to the gate and eventually, they've learned how to get themselves, onto the airplane by themselves. I think that's a useful way to think about, teaching them and then allowing them to do it. Not having them text you all along the way or parking the car and getting into the airport. I think that applies to all these kinds of things. Again, and another example is, if they're having trouble in college, what we want them to do is advocate for themselves. So another side of healthy independence is they're having a problem. You don't go call the dean.
Right.
You say, who do you talk to? Who is the person you go to?
What are the channels? And maybe walk them through the steps.
Exactly. Or say, and anticipate questions that they might have, right? That the dean might have. Or the professor might have.
Maybe you make an index card and you write down 3 or 4 things so you don't forget if you're intimidated in the presence of the dean.
Exactly.
It's funny, these things like mailing a package, that's what my kids refer to as adulting. And they laugh when they talk about adulting. And it's funny for me to think about it because I'm thinking, here I've got these kids that seem so much better trained than I was, and they're bigger and they're out in the world and they grew up more urban than I did. And it's funny to think that, these kids that seem so capable in so many ways, maybe just don't understand how to get the car registered.
Right.
Don't understand that FedEx and the post office and other services can help you get rid of, send home a lot of your extra stuff at the end of the year.
Exactly. Registering a car is a perfect example. You might go to the DMV the first time, but have them look online and write down a list of all the things that they need to bring. They double check with you. You go with them to the DMV and you have them do all the talking. You stand back. You become less of an sort of like I think I mentioned in your book, less of the quarterback and more of the coach on the side. Mm-hmm. They've got to become the quarterback and you have to become less and less and less of a coach.
So this type of parental letting go and coaching all the way, helping all the way along, it's going to help both you and very much the kids. What about the whole feeling that the kids have when they master these things that seem like cute little adulting tasks to me?
Well, you led right to where I was going to go to next, which is the proof is how they feel afterwards. Mm-hmm. So, for example, my daughter recently, she's a college graduate out of a few years. She closed a bank account because she was moving states. Mm-hmm. And she closed one bank account, withdrew the money, and then set up a new bank account in the next state. But the first bank account, who I'll remain unnamed, The first bank then charged her some $38 overdraft fee.
Oh.
She called us up immediately.
Because she moved the money and there was
some
a problem.
Intermediate problem, some transitional issue with the bank, which is a normal thing that can happen. Like as adults, we encounter those kinds of difficulties.
We don't even blink because we know these are on every corner. But this is new for her.
Right. Completely new. And it was her own bank account. The first one was her own in her own name. It was set up right after college. And this is another new bank account totally on her own. But she called to say, what do I do? And I said, what do you think you should do? What should you do? Oh, I should probably call Bank A. And I said, yes. So she calls Bank A, and I get a call later that week that said I called Bank A, and I took care of it, and they erased the charge. And I wasn't watching her because we were on the phone, but I could tell there was a big smile on her face.
She was empowered.
Exactly.
I can take care of this.
Right. If I can handle the big Bank A, then I can really do many things for myself.
Yep. And there's so many of these annoying little obstacles in life. And I think our generation in particular shielded the kids from a lot of these things,
Because it's easier. They're so busy. They've got so much to do in
high school.
I know
how to do it. I just don't have time to explain it. But then we create kids that don't have a lot of the practical skills. Mm-hmm. Or perhaps some of the kids that have had both parents there and enough income to not have to do these things themselves. I think some of the kids that grow up more lower income are scrappier because they've done these things all along.
That's right. This is a class issue that we're talking about here.
It's, yeah. So what should you do when I'm not talking about cute little silly, I can't mail my package crises, but what should you do when the first crisis with quotes around it hits? What might constitute a crisis? You certainly have a lot of patience, and I know you hear a lot of these things. And then what do you do when that happens?
So the first three things you should do are listen, listen, listen. Get your child to talk it out to you, because the likely thing is your child can manage through that crisis. When we think about it, there are very few crises that they can't manage by themselves. The overwhelming, catastrophic crises are fortunately rare. But the typical crisis they may call about is one in which once their emotional state ratchets down, the role we have initially is to listen so they can bring their temperature down. Because usually we're called when they have a raging fever, so to speak. So what you want to do is the Tylenol or aspirin they need at that moment is just listening to get them to talk it out, to list all the issues, and then to say to them, how can we solve this?
By talking it out, does something go on in their brain that slowly starts to figure it out? Is the talking through just part of the figuring out thing? Right.
There's a concept in mindfulness thinking, which is one of having a wise mind and an emotion mind. And when we're in emotion mind, we can't really think. So when you get that crisis call, they're not going to be able to think. But what you want to do is help bring that temperature down by talking, reflecting, and getting them to make a list of pros and cons, how I can solve it. It doesn't mean you can't give them advice. So I'm not trying to at all give the impression that you should stop giving advice when they're out of the house. But you want them to get there first. Sort of like they get to the finish line before you do, is a concept that I like to think about. But if they're struggling with it and you have an answer, then you can sort of lead them down that direction. Now, we also know from adolescents, and a lot of college kids are still adolescents, they don't like our advice. They call us up to complain. This is a typical thing that teenagers.
But they don't want to hear it.
Right. So I'm in a fight with my girlfriend, and as a parent, that relationship's over. And it's a disaster for your child, and it's taking away from their life.
Heaven forbid you say that.
But what they need to hear is break up with that girlfriend.
Right.
But you want to get them to that point. You want them to get to the finish line. So you ask all kinds of questions. Well, how does your girlfriend make you feel? How often has this happened? Does this sound like a pattern? How often has this happened? Have you talked to your roommates? What did they say? Like, what do your friendship group say about your girlfriend? And so that might help you get the way. By asking questions, you may lead them down a path where they get to your conclusion. But if you started off by saying, I've told you 1,000,000 times to break up with Sarah, well, if you've told them 1,000,000 times and they haven't broken up, clearly that line of intervention is not working.
Right.
So again, the idea is get them to answer the questions, get them to do the work.
That also could backfire on you. Because what if they decide this girlfriend, boyfriend is here to stay? Maybe you're going to be shut outside the door for a while.
That is true. That there's always a risk. Now, they may not take our advice.
Right.
But I think going through this process is helpful to them in any event. And they've gone through it with you, and the next time they call, you could say, well, we're going to go through this process again.
Right.
Let's go and think it through.
They want to make their own decisions. They need guidance in doing that.
Exactly.
And not a pronouncement from on high. And besides, you're of a different generation, and you really might not have the best answer coming from your perspective. We don't necessarily have the right answer.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. So how, and this is related, but how quickly should you run to the rescue when you get, I mean, this is some kind of a gentle rescue, but I once interviewed a psychologist that worked with adolescents, and when her son went off to college, she said she set up a weekly phone call and used texts for like how many quarters go in the washing machine, but that weekly phone call, and that was on Sunday at 4:00, so the son knew that he had that to rely on. But she said most of the time, you know, there'd be a text and maybe there was an issue on Tuesday, but most of the time he'd figured it out by Sunday.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. And I think having some structure to your relationship sort of helps both sides. Mm-hmm. That weekly phone call, I think
that's a good idea, right? To schedule that at a certain time.
It's really nice. The kid may buck at it and not be happy about it, but I think that it sort of helps mitigate the loss and the separation. If you don't have much to talk about, the conversation does not have to be for an hour. That's another thing I encourage parents to take the child's lead for how long that weekly conversation should be, because you want them to not dread the conversation. You want them to look forward to the conversation. So pay attention to their cues, and don't be upset if they're calling you. So here's another thing that this generation does with their cell phones is they call between classes. Yeah. Right? So they're in college and they're going between classes, and you get them breathless as they're walking in that 10-minute passing period. Yeah. That's okay. Take that as a good sign that they're calling you.
Take what you can get.
Exactly.
Yep. And I think I'm back to our Jeffrey Jensen, our net friend. He says he keeps stressing, let the kids initiate the communication. Mm-hmm. And a lot of deans have told me, I've had deans in the gym next to me just pulling their hair out, talking about parents like having to minister or be the psychotherapist to parents who really, the kid is fine. Right. But the parent is just pounding the phones in the dean's office. But the idea is take a breath, get sort of re-involved with your friend groups, with your spouse, with whoever else is in your life, and let the kid take the lead on the communication.
Right. And you were asking a minute before we got off topic about when do you have to jump in? Right? Yeah. So that's a very important question. I don't want us to lose sight of that one.
Yep. Good.
The way I think about that those are emergency situations. And I would look at, we all know our children best, and we all know the sound of their voice. So you want to use your gut first. And if you're feeling that feeling that something's really awry, it's not the typical run-of-the-mill classroom problem, friend problem, romantic problem, a problem with a bank. But what you want to look at is the broader picture of how are they doing. So are they sleeping? Are they eating? Are they going to class? Are they still seeing their friends? Are they leaving their room? Mm-hmm. If any of those things seem to be going off the rails, then that's a time to worry. But I would
that's an indicator. Yeah.
But you want to look at their behaviors because we don't have the ability to really be with them and get lots of feedback once they leave the house. But I would think about, have they gone to the dining hall? Are they still exercising? Are they engaging in their normal activities? Mm-hmm. Use that as indicators and factors in your decision of whether you need to actually go and do more.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. But now back to the whole, you and I spoke earlier about how teens and toddlers, and I'd love to pull that back, how teens and toddlers have similar things, I have to say things, not being a scientist, going on in their brains. Why do young adults get so riled up or take such a dramatic approach to problems that often turn out to be small? What's with the chemistry of a teen and a toddler, and how can we think about that? And even a young adult. Maybe it doesn't necessarily stop in the teenage years.
It doesn't, and there's a broad range of development, so some kids arrive early, some kids arrive later. The way I like to think about it visually, it's as if the brain of a toddler and the brain of a teenager is on fire. It's literally on fire. They look like us, they talk like us, they somehow act maturely, but we get fooled easily because even though they can act in such ways and you go, wow, my son seems like he's 30 today, look how he handled that situation, but then the next day...
He reads Shakespeare, he can do his calculus lesson.
Exactly, more complicated chemistry than I ever did, and even negotiate social relationships better than I ever did. But inside their brain, they're going to have decompensations, because there's a rapid transformation going on inside the brain of a toddler as well as an adolescent and late adolescent. The brain is rewiring It's pruning away synapses that aren't necessary. The hormonal surges are creating new synapses and creating new connections, and it's happening way too fast for the mind to actually comprehend and compensate for.
It's a lot of chaos.
A lot of chaos up there. So if you took an fMRI or some PET scan of the brain of a toddler, it's actually going twice the rate of our brains. And it's very similar for adolescents, although theirs is a little bit more controlled. But the key thing in the brain is that we have the front part of our brain, which is our executive, like the CEO. It's the prefrontal cortex. It's where the executive functioning happens, planning, judgment, decision-making, thinking about the past, present, future, all the kinds of things that we take for granted as adults. That hasn't come online fully in adolescence. And what's raging...
Is 26 the number for that? Where's the line on when that's supposed to come online? I'm waiting for that.
I think every year we boost it up one more. So if you ask me now, we'd say, 23, 24. Maybe in a few years we'll hopefully we'll get a lock there. But what's happening is that the deeper part of the brain that controls emotion, that's raging inside their brain. Fear, anger, distress, sadness, every kind of emotion is at a peak level.
And that's normal. That's part of the developmental process.
Right. And I can give you, we all get yelled at by our kids over the smallest things. So if, we have a new backup camera in our car, and I've been backing up looking over my shoulder for 40 years now.
And you're continuing to do so.
Yes. But my children make fun of me and get pissed off at me at a level that's way out of proportion.
Yeah. Because
I continue to put my arm on the headrest next to me and look back, and they're screaming at me.
You don't trust that camera.
And that's a small little example, but we also know that inside the brain of an adolescent that social rejection lights up in the same place as the death of a loved one.
Wow.
So social rejection for adolescents is so painful. So it's very hard for us to often identify with that or even remember that. And so that's something that we often get, misaligned with our kids over, because we're thinking that's not such a bad thing. But yet for them, the world is over. They stop going to classes. They stop showering, all because they were rejected socially. Wow. We are fine with it because while we might get angrier, and we have a lot of coping mechanisms to deal with it. We have lifelong other friendships in many ways that we regulate those feelings, but adolescents really cannot. So if they get rejected by a sorority, a fraternity, or their friends turn on them, or
it's huge.
Something, it's really, it's probably like the worst thing that can happen to.
It's
to
like they put those ratings on the earthquake scales, right? And so we're just feeling a very slight tremor.
Exactly.
And it's huge. So that's why we don't fully understand how that can be so big. We're thinking, that boy, really? I mean, I wouldn't waste 5 minutes on that, when you don't realize that they're perceiving it very differently based on their developmental stage.
Exactly.
Oh, isn't that interesting? These are good things to think about when we're baffled as parents at some dramatic reactions. You told me when I was working on my book, don't meet their level of agitation. When you have a kid come to you, what do you mean? You don't want. I'm thinking of someone playing tennis and hitting a tennis ball on a backboard and how it comes back about the same way, right?
Right. And for tennis, that works beautifully. You actually want to meet your opponent's level of force and power.
That's tennis.
And if you don't do that, you lose.
Okay.
If you watched Serena Williams last night, her opponent couldn't match her level of athleticism and power. When it comes to parenting, it's a lot different. So teenagers, adolescents, late adolescents, young adults are still in that phase where when they get upset about something, they get really upset. Their temperature goes, their blood pressure is boiling. If you try and talk to them at that level, it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. You need to, again, we talked about lowering their temperature. Yeah. So one of the ways to lower that person's temperature is to speak with a calm, soft, steady voice, looking them in the eye. Because even if they're coming at you with something they're angry at you about, getting equally angry back at them is going to lead nowhere. In fact, lead to breakdown in your relationship. Right. So the best way is to say, tell me more. There's those same kind of concepts I started us off with. Listen, actively listen, empathize. I think another thing that's true at all levels of parenting is if they say that they're really upset about something and you feel like, what's the big deal there? They'll sense that immediately, like by a comment or piece of advice or something that they can anticipate you saying. But if you say, that really sucks, so here's like take-home message number, whatever we're up to, that really sucks, or that's really bad, that is horrible. Like, even if it's not the worst thing, that sort of breaks the ice.
Yeah.
And that will help decrease their temperature because they go into the situation totally consumed with it. And they need someone to say yes. They want you to join with them.
Yeah.
And then you could work your way through it and maybe point out how it wasn't so bad. But if you start off with, that's not really so bad, or the other thing to avoid
then you're just locked out.
Right. And the other thing to avoid in terms of the column of don't do's, don't say other people have it worse. That's like throwing flame on the fire. Now, it may be legitimate and valid and the most appropriate thing to say.
Right.
You can, again, save that for later in the conversation.
Yeah.
But when they come at you with their emotionality supercharged, things like that will totally backfire.
Wow, that's great. All right, well, wrapping up, Michael, what, you're a parent of 2, and plus you have all this wonderful advantage of so many hundreds of patients that put all this, that have given you so much experience in this. What advice would you dispense for empty nesters regarding parenting young adults? Just kind of off the top of your head, as a parent, what's the cream that I can skim from the totality of your experiences in this regard?
So one, you're not alone. Many people are going through the same exact thing. And that same exact thing is a range of emotions. You may feel sad. You may feel lonely. You may have regrets. You may feel guilty. You may question your parenting. But you also may be kind of secretly happy. Don't feel guilty about that happiness. You have earned it. You've earned your time, either by yourself or with your spouse or with friends. And so don't feel guilty about that happiness that you might feel. The excitement, the sense of, I don't have to worry. The unburdening of letting your child go is a wonderful kind of feeling. And take advantage of that. Develop some new interests. Do things you hadn't really been able to do before. You don't have to worry about cooking everyone's favorite meal all the time, or making sure, whatever is going on for your child. You now get to have this luxury of time. It's a balance of feelings, the empty nest. So you're going to feel happy at times. You're going to feel sad at times. All of that is normal, and it's a process. Over time, that separation will start to feel better and better. And here's the key thing. They get much more interesting as they get older. And as a child psychiatrist, the 3-year-old is more interesting than the 2-year-old. The 7-year-old is more interesting than the 5-year-old. And I think people nod when I say this. Your college kid who you're seeing less is so much more interesting. They'll come and tell you things you hadn't even learned. My son the other day was telling me all about how his professor's connecting A and B and C and D, and my mouth dropped open. And I thought, that is fascinating. You get to be an observer of their brain developing, right? Mm-hmm. You get to see them go from 18 to 22. What I love about the work I do with college students is they get better sometimes even on their own because their brain is developing. But you watch them become separation avoidant to independent to adults who have their own thoughts and ideas. And if things are going well, they'll share those with you. That's the goal, right? That's like the good stuff we're looking for, is sort of like that conversation that we all have with our kid and we go, wow. Sort of like when they first learned language when they were, 18 months and you say to your, husband or wife or partner and you say, wow, can you believe what Julia just said today? Or she had 4 more words, or her sentences had 5 words. You count 1, 2, 3, 4. It's kind of like that again when you have a college age or a young adult who's off in the workforce. So you want to look forward to those kinds of moments. And you also want to just check your enmeshment at the door when they call you up. Allow them, again, as I've been saying, I think the sort of main point here is allow them to be separate, thinking, cognate individuals. And I think then you'll get to enjoy the rewards of that. Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. Well, thank you, Michael, so much for sharing all these years of experience, professional and personal, that you have with me and our HappiNest audience. And thanks so much for your time, and I'll let you go on to your next patient.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into my HappiNest podcast, where we explore how to get the best out of the empty nest. I hope you'll subscribe, write a review, and reach out to me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Check out my website, judyhollandauthor.com. Have a great day, and remember, make it happen.